I particularly recommend. Oh God, that's exciting. Jesus, it's like a plane taking off. Okay, so welcome to everybody here in the auditorium and everybody at home to this event to mark International Women's Day. I'm Dorothy Byrne. I'm the president of Mary Edwards College, and we have here with us an absolutely wonderful panel to look at the way forward for women. But as part of that, we're going to start by looking at the perspectives of different women and the ways in which they see the key issues. So on my left, I have Shikemi. You've all got the full biography, so I'm not going to read it all out, who is the JCR rep, but that's Junior Common Room, for those of you who didn't go to Newhall, rep for ethics and the environment. And next to her, our JCR president, Malini. And then we have Ellie Fielding with us, who started this extraordinary magazine, The New Feminist, that I really recommend to you. I mean, brilliant articles in it. Lucy Delap, who is our own professor, who's written many books, but in particular, her latest book, Feminisms, A Global History. And you actually describe it in a very nice way, the richness of the global feminist past. And I can't recommend it highly enough as just telling you about all these feminists of the last 150 years all over the world that I had never heard of. You know, we're told, oh, feminism, it's just, you know, an American and Western European thing. And then you read in the book all these Chinese feminists and Indian feminists and just often way ahead of what was happening in Britain and America. And finally, Natasha Walter, who I'm sure many of you have read her books. Living Doll, it is Living Doll, or Living Dolls now, yeah, is her most recent one. And you will also know her as a broadcaster, a dramatist, and Natasha also set up the charity Women for Refugee Women. And, you know, the first thing really I should have said is that tonight we're obviously thinking about Ukrainian women and how we have seen them suffering. And that's a very important perspective to women and to feminism that Natasha has talked about a lot. So before I kick off, I thought it would be only fair if I said the perspective of an older woman, because you're all younger women, because I've realized doing this new role how we all see women's issues differently and how we all define feminism differently. So for me, I went to university in 1969. And that was 2 years after the pill had come in. And our big issue then was contraception and abortion. 3 girls in my class had got pregnant and had to have babies. We went to a convent where we were all very exercised, including the nuns, about the fact that contraception wasn't available in South America. And South American women, you know, it was estimated at that time that up to 1 million women were having illegal abortions in South America, and thousands dying. We were also obsessed with what really our big thing was. We went to university to be sexually active because that hadn't been possible because of the lack of contraception and abortion. And but we were really concerned about page 3 and top shelf magazines, as we called them. And now when you look at all the porn on the internet and everything, that just seems you know, so timid in comparison. Our vision of feminism was solidarity. We were obsessed with the notion all women are the same, and I think that has really moved on. And I'm really ashamed to say this, we were not very ambitious. You know, we were quite unusual in having gone to university as women then, but we didn't have great professional ambition. And one of the things I love in my current job is how incredibly ambitious you all are, and, you know, how you're all going to be partners in law firms or run major charities or, you know, take over Boris Johnson. So that's fantastic. So I would like to start by asking Shikemi and Malini to explain a bit about what are the key issues for women for you.
So I think Malini and I are obviously in the same year, so we're both second year and 20-year-olds at university. So we have quite similar views, but I think the main thing that we have kind of identified as being an issue or something that's come to prominence in our generation is the issue of intersectionality, or perhaps not the issue, but the fact that it's really important to consider a variety of different backgrounds when speaking about feminism. So I think in the past, perhaps feminism was very just focused on like being female or identifying as female, whereas now it's important to think about how other issues play in, like age and sexuality and race, and how they all come together to create a woman, I guess. And when speaking about feminist issues, that it's really important to look at the fact that people might not be facing issues purely because they're women, but that every woman will have a different experience because of lots of different social factors coming to play all in one. So yeah, we just found that really interesting thinking about that. And as a geography student, it's something that we kind of cover quite a lot in our course, and we always try to look from a marginalized lens at all of the issues that we cover. So looking at gender in development, for example, and why it's really important to look from a female perspective when making development goals. So I think that, yeah, in our generation, things are definitely changing, and we do look at a range of different issues as a whole. But yeah, intersectionality is definitely the key thing. But I don't know if Marley has anything to add.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, intersectionality is, I think, the biggest thing that our kind of generation has put an onus on, I think, in terms of feminism and how that's changed. I mean, just as you said, back in the day, it was all about solidarity. You know, it was about all women are the same and we're just fighting for one thing. And then that was kind of more clear because there was kind of one goal that all women were kind of fighting towards, you know, contraception or abortion rights or whatever it may be. But now there are so many different subsections, and what's so great about like kind of modern feminism is that we appreciate that not everyone's primary identity might be that they are a woman. So you can be a woman, but your primary identity might be that you're black or that you're religious, your religion or whatever it may be. But it's not necessarily, it's not the assumption that you're a woman. And that is your primary kind of struggle and your primary kind of reason, your raison d'être, you know, whatever it might be. But I think that's kind of the most important thing, is that we have tried to distinguish between different women and create those subsections to target things properly and to actually go into enough detail into specific topics that potentially one big, you know, umbrella feminism might not do.
And of course, for your generation, the definition of what a woman is, that wasn't an issue I thought about in 1969, but now, you know, our college is a college for anybody who identifies as a woman. How important, and non-binary people come to our college too, how important is that issue for you?
I think it is quite important in terms of not making assumptions, because maybe in the past you'll look at a woman and say, oh, she must be a feminist. Or if I say look at a woman, look at someone who was born as a woman. But I think that nowadays it's a lot more important to not just assume based off looks, and it's kind of about who identifies as a woman. So it's definitely a lot more complicated in that factor, but I think that it's something that people are trying to do more and more in our generation and kind of passing it on to other generations as well. And social media has definitely helped a lot with that. So.
And Marlene, in everyday life at the university, what are your, the main concerns that bother you when you're thinking about going out or living your life? Because that's a thing that we all in every generation have known. What's it like now for you as a young woman at university?
Yeah, it is quite kind of a sad sad picture I'm about to paint, I guess. But I literally have not been, out clubbing as a normal student since all of these kind of spiking attacks have been happening. So obviously, it's been quite widely reported in the news, but spiking has become even more insidious. People are going out now with actual needles, which is slightly terrifying, which has just essentially kept me inside, which is, I think, quite sad. And obviously, it's not the saddest thing in the world, but as a student, and I know that many women are feeling the same way, and anyone who particularly feels marginalized is feeling the same way about going out. It's not safe, and the whole idea of what feminism is to us is that now it needs to be more kind of anyone. It's just equality for everyone and anyone. I feel like the onus shouldn't be on women anymore, regardless of who falls under that women category. It should be about equality for all, we should all be able to walk out and go into a nightclub, enjoy ourselves, come home safely and sleep, however we may, please. It's just, I find it quite a shame that we're still at this point and that people are kind of developing new methods to target women and target people. There are positives, but
if you feel you literally don't want to go out. I think a lot of people here would be appalled by that. And, the police, the university authorities, what should other people in Cambridge be doing about this? I know there's a Reclaim the Night march coming up on Friday, but I doubt that older women here who went to Cambridge would say they literally felt too afraid to go out. This is definitely a decline.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if I'm not kind of with a boy, essentially, if I'm not with another man, I don't feel safe. And even when we're kind of going out as a group of girls, it is just slightly terrifying because we just don't know. I've been spiked before, and that was at a house party when I was 16. So, and I've kind of moved on from that, but then this new whole thing has, resurfaced and come back with a vengeance. So yeah, it's really sad.
I think also it's quite sad how it's become very normalized because of social media, because with the spiking incidents that have been happening, everyone's been talking about them. And I was telling Marley and Dorothy earlier on about how last week my friendship group, or the people I live with, we went to the club. I didn't actually go, but the next morning they were all talking about how their experience at the club, and they were talking about how men were grabbing them inappropriately. And comments were kind of going around that, oh, this is not an excuse, but it happens everywhere. We're kind of used to it because it's just what happens when you go out. You can expect to kind of be touched inappropriately. And it's turned into a kind of jokey thing that you'll be like, oh, haha, remember this guy that was following you around? But I think it becomes more of a joke in an attempt to kind of take away from the seriousness of it and to make it a bit more palatable, rather than kind of wanting to face the fact that it's not a very comfortable thing. And people will say things like, oh yeah, it did make me feel disgusting, or yeah, I had to give my friends eyes to come and help me and stuff like that. But yeah, it's just become very normalized, and I think that when you hear about spiking incidents happening now, it's just oh, another one, rather than, well, this is actually quite shocking that this is happening so frequently, which is obviously a real shame. But.
So Ellie, both for you and for your readers and the many writers you have, what are the key issues for you? And do feel free to just explain a little bit about your fantastic magazine, because I really do want everybody to go away and read it and maybe sponsor it as well.
That would be great. So my journey into feminism was very late. Compared to a lot of the people around me, a lot of my friends, I came into feminism considerably later. And I found, as a 19-year-old trying to enter this movement that was already so, of course, so established, I found it kind of inaccessible. And there are so many different definitions, and it looks so different for everyone that I found it really hard to access. And then throughout my journey, I realized that other women feel the same. And it's funny because you mentioned solidarity, and I believe in that, but just it looks very different for me. Solidarity to me means agreeing on the fact that feminism does look different for everyone, and that in turn, like what you guys were saying with intersectionality, like the modern feminism, that's a huge, I think, the main issue even, because what that does is it focuses on the fact that feminism does look different for everyone. So the idea of the New Feminist, when I founded it, I actually started it thinking it was just going to be like my personal blog. It kind of spiraled, which is great because a lot of people agreed with what I was doing. And the concept is just to make feminism this non-judgmental, accessible space that basically says that it looks different for everyone. And it's okay to take the time to learn and to make mistakes and to experience feminism in your own way and acknowledge that globally it looks a lot different. In terms of key issues, it's funny because obviously everyone on my team, they have something that is very important to them. Maybe it's based on a personal experience, maybe, it's something they just picked up on. But I think what I found, and now this is coming from someone who is a new feminist, so bear with me, but what I found is that, to me, everything is connected. We recently, amazingly, interviewed Maya Bialik, who, if you don't know, she was Amy in The Big Bang Theory. She's incredible. She's a neuroscientist in real life, which is amazing. And she was celebrating International Women's Day with us. And what she said, which I hope she doesn't see this because I'm about to disagree slightly, is that even though topics like having plastic surgery, does that make you a feminist, is interesting and makes great cocktail conversation, it's not important compared to, human sex trafficking and gender-based violence. And of course, I agree with that. But the one thing I do disagree on is the fact that they're all linked. And it doesn't matter where we start, as long as we start somewhere, I think it will cause a domino effect. The reason why women are getting plastic surgery is because of the male gaze, because of this patriarchal view that, we have to live up to this beauty standard. And if we are able to just simply respect women and take away this concept of a beauty standard, then maybe women won't be objectified as much, dehumanized as much. And I think that truly will have a domino effect. The whole reason women are sex trafficked is because they're viewed as this object, it's because they're dehumanized. So I think you can talk about key issues and where to go, but everything is connected and everything is interlinked. So as long as we are on the same page and there is solidarity on the fact that we need equality, it doesn't matter where you start, as long as you do.
Natasha, I'm going to jump to you because you changed your view, didn't you, from your first book to your second book? You admitted that
I got things wrong.
That you got things wrong, which, may I say, I know we shouldn't say men and women are really different or anything because you prove in your book that's not really true. But hey, she admitted she got things wrong, and I haven't heard a lot of that from the government.
Where you get things wrong and to listen to one another. Sorry, I've got my mic. Hello, is that working? Yeah.
and actually to listen to what...
No, it doesn't. It's not working.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Say shout if you can't. I'll talk up a bit. But I think it is really important to have these conversations and to admit that we can change and that we can really learn from each other. And before I start off with what I was prepared to say, I just really want to respond to what our first two speakers said, because actually I was really moved and shocked by what you said, and I feel that my generation has really let you down, actually. The idea that young women are feeling afraid to go out at night because of the epidemic of violence that they're facing in urban centres, I think is shocking, and it shows us the urgency, I think, of what we're facing and why we still need feminism and why we still need, as you say, solidarity, so that we can acknowledge differences, not just acknowledge differences, really respond to differences and talk about differences and not be ashamed of our differences or try and hide them away, but nevertheless try and act together. And I think it's clear that that's particularly needed around the issues of violence, particularly violence against young women, like you were talking about. We hear so much more now, I think, about violence against women from all sorts of women from different backgrounds, but we aren't acting on it. I mean, it's shocking to hear what you say and to think that effectively, over the last few years, rape has been decriminalised in this country. I mean, the figures are absolutely astounding. When I wrote my first book in 1998, I was shocked by how few rapes, when reported to the police, lead to a conviction. And the rate is just falling and falling. So now fewer than
I should say 1%, really, just over.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, great. Working now. Thank you. Well, fewer than 1 in 60 rapes that are reported to the police end in a charge, let alone a conviction. So I think it's issues like that where we really have to step up as feminists and insist on action. And I hear what you're saying about intersectionality, and I think that is the big change that I've seen, during my lifetime in feminism, that we do see so many more women from different backgrounds speaking up. But I'd like to come on to the issue around refugees and displacement. But before I do, can I just also touch on one that I think is often overlooked, which is the issue of class and poverty. And I just want to mention that because I think at this moment, particularly globally, but particularly in this country, when we face what's euphemistically called this cost of living crisis, I think it's really important that we speak about poverty and about poverty as a women's issue, that more women than men are still in poverty and that women from minoritized backgrounds more likely to be in poverty, and we mustn't overlook that as one of the key intersections. I think we're often in danger of doing that. But can I spend just a few minutes talking about refugees and displaced women, because that's where I've spent the last few years of my life, particularly working. I mean, I was drawn to work in this area because of an encounter I had personally. I was working as a journalist, as a writer, and very active around issues around British feminism, the challenges that young women were facing in terms of sex objectification and so on. But I met this woman, I was working as a journalist, who really kind of shook me up and changed me and spoke to me. A woman who'd fled the violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the civil war there. And she'd been targeted because of the political activities of her father. She'd been taken into prison where she'd experienced extreme sexual violence. I don't need to talk, we're all familiar with the kind of stories that we hear about, the wars that are fought on the bodies of women. And finally, when she'd managed to escape, get to the UK, hoping for a place of safety, instead she'd been refused asylum. And when I met her, she was living completely destitute on the street, just walking from one charity to another. And at that point, heavily pregnant because of violence she suffered here in the UK. And it shook me. I have to say, it really shook me. It made me realise that a lot of what I'd been fighting for alongside other women quite like me, were the rights of women who had the rights of citizens. And we have to expand that. We have to see what women go through when they're displaced, when they lose the protection of the state. And obviously that's key today, when we look at the new refugee crisis that's been created in Europe. And I hope that there's something that we can find in our hearts when we look at that to make us realise that these are women like ourselves. We need to open the doors, extend hands of welcome. But I also do slightly worry, I hope this doesn't come over at all in the wrong way, that our focus on Ukrainian women might blind us or blur the contours of some of the other crises, the Afghan women, where the West bears so much responsibility, or, you know, women still coming from conflicts like in the Congo. The conflict hasn't ended, although it's forgotten, you know, it's not on the front pages. So let's remember that. And my experience personally, setting up an organisation, Women for Refugee Women, was that solidarity is real. You know, at that organisation, we didn't want to do the classic charity thing of looking at women as victims, waiting for a handout, but I feel that I was really mentored. I really learned from the refugee women I worked alongside, and I'm really glad to say that organisation is now led by a refugee woman from the Rwandan genocide, Alphonsine Kabagabo. Please support what the organisation is doing at the moment to welcome women and to challenge the injustices they face. I think, you know, just to feel that, you know, it's a really hard time that we face now, the conflicts, climate emergency, and I know there are things that most of us, luckily, we haven't experienced firsthand, the destruction of homes and our environments, but time could be running out. You know, we haven't necessarily got a long time to try and build the sort of societies we want. So this is still an urgent struggle, I think, fighting for women's rights.
Thank you. So, as our professor of history here, I'm very interested, obviously, in your perspective of what you think the key issues are at the moment, including for you as a person of your generation, and thinking about going forward. But I think there are some historical points here as well that you may wish to pick up on.
Yes, I mean, it's always tempting for historians to turn around and start looking backwards, but I do think that we can really learn a lot from the past. And in particular, I was really taken with your lovely, crisp summaries of what intersectional thinking is like and how important it is today. And your sense of, I think all three of you had a sense of kind of a generational, a distinctive take on feminism, I suppose, for young women and non-binary people today. And I think, you know, sometimes there's a temptation to kind of turn your back on the feminist past and say it wasn't what we wanted it to be. You know, it was too bourgeois or too first worldist or too white or, you know, just not really like meshing with the kinds of interests and concerns that you've been talking about today. And yet, when we look back, there is a richer past. And one of our problems is that we often look back to sort of straw figures, straw women, if you like, from the past. In particular, just looking back not very far, 50 years, back to the women's liberation movement. It's been really easy to say, oh, it was all white women and, you know, it was all about getting women good jobs and it didn't really do anything for poorer women and more marginalized women or black women or Asian women. But actually, that concept of intersectionality was definitely there at the time, even though the word wasn't there. And if you look at intellectuals like Patricia Hill Collins, who's a really, you know, prominent African-American woman who was one of the big theorists of the Black women's movement, she talked about the matrix of oppressions. And by that, she meant exactly what Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about when she coined the word intersectionality. Or if you want to go back, you know, a couple of centuries, let's go back to Sojourner Truth, the 19th century African-American former enslaved woman who asked, ain't I a woman? That was her kind of famous platform question, rhetorical question, when she was being objectified for her race. And she wanted to say, in those debates about women's rights, I'm a woman too. I may be a black woman, but I'm a woman too. So there are lots of moments in the past where we can see those ideas and those activists who really can inspire what we do today. One of the reasons why I feel like there's a real urgency today, and it's great that we're having this conversation about feminism, is because there's been a sort of temptation to want to say feminist victories kind of remain won, that we can take for granted some of the advances that have been made around, you know, reproductive rights, let's say, or the kind of the shifts in the criminal justice system that are meant to support women, although have largely failed, as Natasha makes clear. But people used to kind of think the passage of time would just mean that things got better. Certainly my students sometimes say that. You know, they say, well, what makes things better? It's just because new generations come along and they understand better. But today we've got such a vivid landscape of toxic and anti-feminist and misogynist masculinities embodied in some of our political leaders. And I'm talking here about the kind of the awful, overt misogyny of figures like Trump, who united his misogyny and his racism in his politics, people like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, people like Putin, who is, you know, nothing if not a toxic masculinity icon. So we can't assume that the kind of passage of time is just going to make things better. And that's why I feel like there's such an urgent set of issues that are really demanding activism to back them up. And to kind of end on a slightly happier note, we're also at a time not just of kind of great feminist urgency and the need for feminist change, but also of some amazing success stories. So to come back to the Latin American women that Dorothy was so worried about in the 1960s, who were having illegal abortions. And we've had the most amazing good news stories from countries like Colombia and Argentina and Chile, who have extended reproductive rights to women, as well as setbacks in countries like Guatemala, who have just withdrawn some of their rights to abortion. So it's a really interesting landscape. And I guess I want to say, if we look globally, we don't have such a kind of limited feminist past. We've got a really rich feminist landscape, and we can take inspiration from that, both in a contemporary sense and historically.
In your book, you know, you tell us about all these feminists who were in the world at the same time, but they didn't really know about each other. Now we all know about each other, and you know, we will come on in a moment to the negatives of social media and the internet, and we talk about those a lot. But I'm struck that you all feel there's so much positive for women in social media now. I mean, starting with the fact that we all know about each other and can communicate with each other. Do you want to say a bit about that? Because I know you feel some very positive thoughts about that.
So digital media, I think that's one of the reasons why people today sometimes think, okay, feminism is different. It's using these exciting new mechanisms, these scalable, searchable mechanisms that can see Ellie put out a magazine and it could go literally around the world. There's no limit on what you can do there. But I guess I'd like to say maybe it wasn't so different in the past. Maybe those pre-digital media, pre-social media actually had lots of the same potential. So let's think about, you know, whether women knew each other. They were, in fact, running international congresses, and they were using the periodical press to exchange ideas in ways that aren't that dissimilar to what we see today on social media. So, these were cheap technologies, print media, that allowed women to organize on a global scale. And again, we shouldn't assume that the feminist past is so different from the feminist present. I know we're going to talk a bit about like some of the problems people have with it, and I share those kind of, our skepticism about what social media can really do for us when it's actually run by giant tech companies who don't really have the feminist agenda at their heart, and who instead have a real motive to amplify extremist language. And that has been used so effectively by religious fundamentalists, by the far right, by racists. And I think it's quite hard to get a voice and a space for feminist debate that is a productive one in that kind of busy and sort of extremist environment.
Ellie, when you just decided to set up this magazine, which I so admire, I think, women just came to you from all over and offered to write articles and with all different opinions. Tell us a bit about that and the extent to which you feel that social media it can be a positive for women and for feminism.
absolutely. I mean, it's the only thing in the world that can connect people instantly, globally. And it's definitely something I've found so prominent in what I've been doing. I started it by myself and just with, an Instagram account and maybe one ad on LinkedIn. I think our very first ad on LinkedIn got over 200 applicants for a voluntary role. Like, this is not a paid role. So for it to connect that many people instantly, I mean, it happened over 2 days, is incredible. And I think, social media has so much, we have so much to thank social media for connecting each other and for educating one another. I think what started me off on my journey was social media. It was hearing women's stories. With the rise of TikTok, that's all we ever hear. And once you like a couple, they show you more. Obviously, like I was saying earlier, it has its negatives, because even though I might be liking a few videos on women's equality and they'll show me more, which is fantastic because it's educating me, and it's what pushed me to do what I'm doing. It's not the same for everyone. Algorithms on social media can be very dangerous. They can be very toxic. Your 14-year-old just standard boy growing up in even just a normal household, whatever normal looks like, could, like one video that has some kind of misogynistic undertone and just be fed that and just continuously fed that. And that can shape someone, and it has shaped many people. As we know, many people are shaped by what they're being fed through the internet. So I think, it's funny for me to say because I'm running something online, so of course you expect me to only praise it, but there are incredible positives and there are detrimental negatives at the same time.
So Malini, I see you nodding both to the positive and negatives. What would you say from your perspective?
Yeah, I think just to speak to what you were talking about is that the whole confirmation bias with social media, I think it's quite potent. Just the way that you can just be fed exactly your opinion back to you, and you don't even question it because you think, oh well, it's a global platform. Why would I be kind of feeding myself my own biases? But it's so real, and I feel like if you don't realize that, you are just going to be trapped inside. And even if you do realize it, I'm so easily just sucked into this like loophole of just my own opinions. I mean, even if you just look at someone else's social media, you see exactly what they believe essentially. Yeah, I think you can probably tell exactly what someone's opinions are from their TikTok, essentially, which is terrifying. But I think on another point, it's just that if you're kind of only seeing yourself, that's what's so great about the New Feminist is that you've got this platform that's it shows loads of different opinions, but it's not necessarily championing anyone's. And you can kind of go there and kind of see exactly, you can read about different things. But also, I think, just to touch on a slightly different point, is that what gets to the top at social media is kind of the poles, that's it. the polar kind of
divides.
Opinions. It's the ones that will cause the biggest debate, the biggest discussion. The New Feminist, a lot of what you're going to be writing about is not going to cause the biggest discussion, but it's going to cause discussion that's meaningful. If you've got something that's, literally clickbait essentially, and, the angry, misogynists are going to start typing away and creating their anonymous accounts and going on and, all of this, that's not helpful debate. That's not going to educate anyone. But, as you said, we were talking backstage earlier, we were kind of saying how you had responded to some of these angry messages once and they had come back to you and said, oh, okay, I'll have a read. Oh, actually, okay, you've got a point. That kind of space is helpful. But, when you look at a TikTok, for example, that's just completely, one side and the extreme of that side, I don't think it's necessarily a helpful discussion to any of it.
But, of course, Shikemi, you and Malini have used new modes of communication to set up your own podcast. So it's which you can all listen to. So it has got those great advantages, whereas for Natasha and I as journalists, we had to get often a man to publish our story, and I'm sure we both experienced the same thing of them saying it's not a story. And I've often talked on World in Action, where I was the only woman at the time, saying I wanted to do my first film on rape and marriage, and the most senior man, as in he'd been there longest, who himself used prostitutes when he went out filming, told me it wasn't a story. But you can communicate anything to the world.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's such a good thing, because with social media, you can access so many different people. Again, we were talking about it in the other room, that with social media, it's not very exclusive, because anyone can make anyone with access to internet. Obviously, that's another issue that we have to be careful about, like speaking from a westernized bias, because not everyone has access to internet or to mobile phones and stuff. But for the most part, people can make social media accounts and get involved in different debates. So there is the positivity in terms of the inclusiveness there, and in terms of reaching a wider range of people. However, I could definitely see some issues with it as well. Touching on what we mentioned earlier about normalizing issues, because I think with apps like TikTok, for example, people go on there to kind of post their experiences, and because it's a fun app, they tend to, I guess, belittle their experiences or to talk about it in a fun way. Maybe it's rape or maybe anything like that, which obviously is completely fine because it's a coping mechanism and people react to situations in different ways. However, then you tend to get that these posts blow up a lot and people are kind of joking about it in the comments, when in reality it's quite a serious thing, and it just is becoming more and more normalized, and people are just, there are so many, you can go through a TikTok For You page, which is like just loads of random posts, and you'll have so many girls just talking about sexual assault, and it's like, oh, ha, ha, ha.
Well, it's trendy, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's become a trend.
Yeah.
There's so many that they kind of, sorry, not to jump in, but it's literally like, there's so many different, with filters, and you get involved and you kind of say, oh, here's my story, ha, ha, ha. Like, we've all been through this thing. I mean, obviously in like a sense of solidarity and with our experiences, but the fact that it's become trendy, I feel like it's strange. It's strange. I mean, at the end of the day, it's odd.
Yeah, like scrolling on TikTok is something that people often do like in bed at night. And it's just weird that I can lie in bed for an hour and just be like looking at people's like stories of how they've been sexually assaulted and stuff. And it's just like, it becomes so normal because you're just doing it as like a nighttime thing, and you don't really actually realize the severity of it, because it is just an app where you go to like be entertained, I guess, which is obviously not entertaining.
It started as a dancing app.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's
extraordinary.
probably not like, there's probably a bad side of social media, and what everybody else has been saying about like getting trapped in kind of what you share is going to be shared to your network, and people tend to have others similar to them in their own network. So it does kind of remain in a bubble of similar people. And I think issues during the pandemic, when Instagram was used a lot more because of lockdowns, people were tended to make like infographics about things that are going on in the world. So with George Floyd, people would make an infographic, and it kind of became like a virtue signaling thing that if you didn't reshare it, then you're wrong and you're anti whatever. Whereas I don't necessarily think that's right, because if you're just sharing it for the sake of everybody else is sharing it, I need to do it, then you're not actually understanding the issue. So I think it does have its problems, but then at the same time, it is spreading the word to a lot more people. And it has meant that things like this can happen and that we can have discussions, because you'll see something like Marlene and I will always just be like, oh, have you seen this? And then it will just turn into a discussion between us about something that we've seen online. So I think that is a good aspect, but obviously it has its flaws as well.
So Natasha, you of course have exposed the normalization of pornography, the massive use of pornography, and the acceptance by large numbers of boys who've never had sex of the notion that sex is about violently abasing a woman.
Yes, and I think, that is one of the huge downsides of this online world, obviously, is the ubiquity of this kind of objectification, violence against women contained, made pornographic, which is terrifying, I think the influence that it has on so many boys and young men. I think it's very interesting hearing from you about, the way that you see, women using social media to express their pain as well. And it reminds me, I think it was Arundhati Roy that said, we need to be careful that these stories don't just go into a kind of marketplace of pain. And I think that is really important. And again, maybe goes back to what we were saying about, we mustn't forget solidarity and actually taking, as you were saying, when you looked at speak to your friend about it, it's really important that if we enter the online world, we don't lose the connection. We're taking it back into a place where we are with one another, learning, having conversations, changing and going out to take action with other people. And I do worry that for some people, that connection is actually sometimes being lost, particularly post-pandemic. But having said that, I think there was a time, I think, in the 80s and 90s where young women who were feminists could often feel extremely alone. Really, I remember getting letters when I was writing in the newspapers from young women saying, I thought I was the only person who felt like this about pornography, who hated Nuts magazine or whatever it was. No young woman now would have to say, I thought I was the only person. So there is that community. But I guess the challenge now for feminists is, can we translate online communities back into real world action again? That, I think, is the real challenge.
So I'm coming now to the audience to see if you would like to make any points or ask any questions while you're having a little thought about that. Lucy, when you listen to that, what does it make you think about what we should consider all sitting here as the ways forward? What should we now be thinking we're going to do?
I've got two kind of comebacks to that interesting conversation. One is to say, if we have a feminist movement or women's movement that doesn't engage men and boys, we're never, ever going to change anything. And I'm particularly interested in this, partly because I've got two sons. And at the time that I had my sons, I started working on a book project which was about men's relationship to feminism in the 1970s and 80s. And when I started that topic, I was asking my colleagues and my students, people I knew who were interested in feminism, I'm going to look at this topic. Where do you think I should go with this? And they almost all said, oh, you won't find anything. There isn't anything. Yeah, Natasha looks shocked because she obviously knows. But as I now know, there actually was a really massive anti-sexist men's movement in the 1970s and 80s. Loads of men's groups, men's centres, men's magazines, men's national conferences, all looking at this question of anti-sexism. And I think there's two things to say. One is a lot of women at the time didn't want to know. And that was maybe fair enough, that they were finding benefits meeting in all-women environments and thinking about their own solidarities, as Dorothy said. And they said to men, if you want to be anti-sexist, just get on with it. Babysit the kids, do a bit more domestic labour, and, learn to talk to other men. And in fact, learning to share emotions and vulnerabilities with other men was a really important tool for that anti-sexist men's movement. So there was some really powerful work done amongst those men. But there was also a very snippy reaction, often quite a sense of kind of shooting down those men who were trying to say, I think I can change and I can be part of that movement of change, which left a lot of those men's groups feeling a bit bruised and a bit like, why did we bother? And a lot of it ran into the sand. So I'd like to think that one of the things about the 21st century is that there's a lot more men who feel like, yeah, I could be part of the women's movement or the feminist movement. And they're there at feminist events, and there's, I think, less of a strong sense of, no, they shouldn't be there, that we should have women-only spaces, and more of a sense of, we might be able to do this together. And that's what I also get from going global in my interest in feminist history, because if you look at women's movements across the global south, they've often developed hand in hand with anti-colonial struggle, and that's very much been a struggle of men and women together against forms of colonial or post-colonial oppression. So I think there's some really great models there for how a feminist movement doesn't necessarily have to be a movement of sex antagonism. So I've kind of got a dream that we might be able to do feminism in a way that really changes the lives of men and boys, who most of them would, I think, agree that they are also impoverished and damaged by patriarchy, and in a multitude of ways. So I think we'd be pushing at an open door if we try to make that happen, and that's the way in which we can maybe challenge some of those experiences of assault and spiking and all these awful forms of behaviour that you guys have been describing.
Does anybody want to make any point? If not, I was going to ask. Oh, did I? Yes.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah, kind of bringing together the 2 points of a really polarized social media environment that we have at the moment and engaging men in these conversations. Sometimes I feel like there's potentially a danger of we're missing out on this connection to potentially like the audience that needs to be engaged the most. Like, for example, a really typical kind of side of TikTok, for example, is this far-right men's movement that we're seeing, and potentially that's one of the most dangerous groups to feminism at the moment. I feel like there's a danger of, at the moment, a lot of social media kind of brushing that off as we don't want to engage with them at all, or there's also a kind of attitude of, it's not our job to educate you. And I feel like some of these routes that we discuss of more moderate views, like, for example, your magazine, there's a risk that the only people engaging with them are the ones seeking that out, potentially. And I just wonder if there's a role of these polarized views where we can really use that to educate the people that we believe need it most. I don't know.
Well, I'm interested in asking you, as representatives of all young people everywhere, what do you feel about that issue of how you engage with men? I mean, I am of the generation that there was the women's reading group and the men's reading group, and sometimes we joined together and read books together, and sometimes we did it apart. And I think it did, that men's movement thing, it was a big thing, but it did sort of peter out. It was like they didn't quite, I don't know what happened. I'll just ask you for a moment, why do you think it petered out?
It was mocked. It was one of the men's groups that I interviewed some people from. They were given the chance to take over Women's Hour. And so this was 1984, 85. They spent a lot of time putting together an hour of programming for Women's Hour. And, that might have been a really great thing for men to have that slot. But that was aired on April Fool's Day. And that is kind of a bit of a mark of what was thought of men's activism, right? It was an April Fool. And they didn't tell the men who'd made the program that it was going out on April Fool's Day. So, they were mocked in the media. The new man was always depicted as a wimp. And I also think something changed in the 1980s around kind of one of the polarizing things that created the kind of angry men's movement that our questioner from the audience talked about, which was the big disputes over child custody and child maintenance, which interestingly really affected some of the men who'd got involved in the women's movement as anti-sexist men, because they wanted to have better relationships with children. And a lot of women were saying, if you want to be an anti-sexist man, step up and do the childcare. But then, in the context of lots of divorces and breakdowns, those men were finding that they never got to see their kids. So that then became a kind of, in the end, an anti-feminist kind of movement, where a lot of men were blaming feminists for that. And I mean, I think they were right to blame the family courts. I think it's been really good that family courts now typically give custody to both parents where they can. And it's been really powerful that men have got more involved in childcare. And a lot of men would say that's been an amazing source of self-growth and self-development for them. Let's not say that this war is over, right, or this battle is over. There's still many men who don't do enough. But I think that's like been a kind of point of leverage where we can see different kinds of masculinities come about. So I would say that the men's movement of the 70s and 80s ran into the quicksand on that awful sort of mire of what to do around child custody and child maintenance. But that in the 2000s, there's been a sort of shift again where men are feeling like getting involved as child carers is a good way for them to grow as a person, and that's very exciting for us.
So, Ellie, from your point of view, how would you see the relationship even of your own publication with men? Do men write into you, or do you publish articles by men? And what would you see as the role of men in supporting women and feminism now?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually feel quite strongly about this topic. And earlier when we were talking about solidarity, I didn't mean solidarity between women. I meant between everyone. And I think it's absolutely, as you were saying, it's imperative that men are on the same page as us. I always say, anyone can be a feminist, but not all women are feminists. And I think that's quite a common misconception. And I think it's something that we need to work towards changing. And going back to social media, these social media bubbles, they are, the other reason they're so toxic is because they're so divisive. We're talking about the bubble we are in as feminists, but the bubble that a lot of these men are in is so polar opposite, and misinformation spreads so easily, and it's so dangerous. And I think that can, really pull people apart and pit people against each other as well, which is awful, especially when the reason that we're arguing was misinformation from the beginning. That's toxic. And in answer to your question, yeah, we do have male writers, and we love, in fact, we have our print magazine coming out, and one of our articles is Why I'm a Feminist, and it's written from the perspective of a man. And I find it so important. I mean, we're called the New Feminist because I would like to think that feminism should include men, and they should be feminists along with us. We're not called the New
That's
Feminist.
interesting, because in my era, we said men can't be feminists. And we mocked Ed Miliband and all those people who wore the T-shirt saying this is what a feminist looks like. So that's a very interesting, different perspective. I'm sure, Malini, that when you were talking about being afraid to go out at night, I mean, you did refer to not, feeling safer if men were with you. And I'm sure that quite a number of people sitting here will be thinking, hello, where are all the men? Where are all the male students in helping and supporting you? So, what are they all saying and doing about this?
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite interesting because there are kind of two ends of the spectrum, and again, it does just stem from this social media and thinking that we can just get all of our information from that platform or whatever, from your mobile phone essentially, and without having to seek out information for yourself rather than just having an algorithm do it for you. I think to answer your question, I'm not sure that polarizing opinions are helpful in the debate. I think that it further alienates men from potentially becoming part of the fight and the cause. I've seen it with my own kind of eyes and speaking to people. Just speaking to your kind of idea of alienation there with the child, parenting rights. It's trickling down. It's really that even just that example I've heard from people my age, and I'm like, you're not a dad. What? But that's still a key thing that they'll point and say, no, but we don't have rights there. But it's still, that's something that they can latch onto. And I think a lot of men have problems with and I mean men that are in those circles, have an issue with positive discrimination. And that's one thing that as women we've kind of, I mean, there's different opinions on it, and I mean, my personal view is that it's great in the short term, and then after that, you know, the balances will kind of weigh themselves, hopefully. But I mean, getting that equality of opportunity to start with, a lot of men nowadays feel like that's unfair, and they don't understand why that isn't unfair in the grand scheme of things. And that further alienates them, I think, when they see these very opinionated people who aren't necessarily kind of a moderate feminist, and they're kind of very polarizing. And that's what they're seeing because of social media and because of those kind of platforms that champion those divisive views that cause stir. I don't necessarily think it is that helpful. And that's what I'm seeing from people in my generation. So it is still kind of trickling down in that kind of way. But of course, there are still people who support us and allies.
What do you think, Shikemi? And I don't know if you told any men you were coming today, and you know, their attitude to women's activism.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. I think I definitely did. I wasn't like just trying to tell women or anything like that, which is quite interesting in itself. And I think that it's happened because of the changing of understanding surrounding the word feminism. So in the past, we were talking about this earlier, like, would you have described yourself as a feminist when you were younger? And I think we both said that probably not, because it seemed, our understanding of it seemed very extreme. It seemed very like you have to like be pro-women and like not like men and stuff like that. And that probably wasn't the truth, but that's the way that it was portrayed to people. So then that obviously caused issues. But I think nowadays, the idea that anyone can be a feminist and that it's such an inclusive term has meant that boys are more and more happy to say that they are a feminist, because it doesn't kind of have as many negative connotations as it did perhaps in the past. But I think that the question about what we can do about it is really interesting, because I found that when I'm writing essays, and I'm sure everyone who's done a degree finds this, it's so easy to be like, this is the problem, and just talk about all the issues that there are. Yeah. But then when you have to think about solutions, it's like, oh wait, actually, I've just spent a lot of time.
I thought you were going to give me all the solutions. No.
I wish I could. I really wish I could. But I think that a potential solution would be to just make sure that people continue increasing equality, but make sure that you're promoting feminism as perhaps not as women focused, but it's an everyone focused thing, and not taking away from the fact that women are at a disadvantage, but also realizing, like we were talking about intersectionality, it's about a lot of things, and it's not about women need to be better. It's about everyone just needs to be able to kind of do what they want to do and how they want to do it. And yeah, I think it's a bit of a tricky topic, I guess, and there's still a long way to go, and I don't think there are any real solutions, but just having discussions about it, being open, and like we tend to do, and not making it a contentious thing, but more just getting information from different people will be so helpful. And hopefully, like, after whoever people we've all told about this panel, watching it might think, oh, well, actually, I just never really thought about that, because I've been realizing a lot of things just speaking now. Like the thing about TikTok, and just the fact that I scroll through it like so absentmindedly, like I have just kind of realized that is actually a bit shocking, that it's quite a normal thing to be reading about all these experiences and not really have a true reaction to it. So yeah, hopefully then things like this will continue to help to make people more understanding of the fact that it's not as radical as perhaps the media portrays it to be, and it is a very inclusive term.
How do you react to that, Natasha, that new idea about feminism? And I'm thinking also, because you've talked in your book about the delusion of the media that men and women are completely different. Yeah.
No, I think there is the potential for true equality between men and women. I don't think we have basic biological differences, but it's so fascinating because I remember being so violently attacked in the 90s for saying that men could be feminists and, that we should have feminism that welcomes men in as well. I was really, I mean, talk about splits in feminism. There've always been really entrenched and bitter splits in feminism, and that definitely I felt a great, force of anger when I was one of those feminists in the 90s that really went out and said, actually, we don't have to be women only in this, and we can work with men, and there's a great history of men being active in feminism, and let's work together and tell men and boys about what they get if we dismantle patriarchy. Yeah, you're going to lose a lot. I mean, not you individually. You can know it's not sort of one individual round, but men will lose a lot when patriarchy is dismantled in terms of the power, in terms of the financial power and the political power, but they'll gain the openness, the empathy, as you were saying, the connection with children. Let's try and phrase it like that. And I think that is really important. And I have a son as well as a daughter, and I'm trying to bring up a feminist boy as well as having brought up a feminist young woman. But having said all that, and that I believe that, and I think it's important to welcome men in, I also think it's really important that we don't actually water this down too much. And for me, feminism is still the movement, the political movement to bring equality and rights for women, equality between men and women, but it's basically, it's the women's movement. And I can't lay that to one side. And I want to go out there, I want to engage with men. I want to encourage men to see what's in it for them as well, if we can crack through the patriarchy. But I don't want to lose that. And in terms of what you're saying about social media, I mean, it's terrifying. Clearly, these far-right men's movements, the incel movement, I think it's terrifying. And I don't think we can water that down. And we've got to, go out there, be challenging it. I'm not maybe of the generation that's going to be compelling for the men that are going, that are engaging with this. But I do hope that your generation is going to find a way to really challenge that and show to men, that they are going to they're going to have to change. And this is really, we've got to be direct, and sometimes it is going to be about being angry and meeting that anger and being fierce about it, and not just saying it's okay, you're welcome here.
I think we have a point up here. Yeah.
I'm going to pose a question, but I want to put a couple of examples before you answer the question. And my question is it actually a power struggle and people don't want to lose power? That is my question. Because I was an undergraduate at Newhall, as it was then, matriculated in 1970, graduated in 1973. I studied material science. I was one of 3 women out of 50 who did metallurgy and material science. As an undergraduate, it wasn't an issue. Nobody thought us odd. I didn't think I was odd. Absolutely fine. No power struggle. We were treated fairly equally. I then started a PhD in the metallurgy department. I hope there's nobody here. And I gave it up after 2 years because of rampant sexism. Because at that point, you were starting to jockey for position, for power. And so they put the women down. And I was well and truly put down. And I went. I did do another PhD at another university in another field. But it was because I think once I was a postgraduate, you were jockeying for power. Who was going to become the postdoc? Who was going to make their way in this, very male-oriented field? Some women were stronger than me and actually managed it. But then coming back to, you mentioned the family courts. I'm also a family court magistrate, and I have seen the power struggle going on in the courts. Yes, the women are very much disadvantaged doing it online. The husband or the father, at home with his fancy laptop, with a woman on some crappy Android phone, no signal. But you get them sitting there, and we'd make the pronouncement, what was according to the law and what we think was right, saying, well, Dad will see little Freddie, X, Y, and Z. Before it was on court, the women would sit like this over my dead body. Actually, when it was online, I actually had them say, over my dead body as he's seeing that child. It's a power struggle. And that's what I'm wondering is actually at the core of all this. Because, again, as an undergraduate, yes, we weren't particularly safe on the streets. There were rapes in Cambridge at that time. But I never, ever, ever felt unsafe in a male college. And if you did have too much to drink, I should admit it, the men would look after you. Because at that stage, but this suddenly, I think the power struggle has now come down, and this is why women are now no longer actually respected, as an undergraduate. So that's my question. Is it actually ultimately about a power struggle? That the men are suddenly seeing, well, actually, if we let the women have a toe in, we are going to lose our power.
Well, Natasha, you look like you want to answer that.
I think a lot of feminism, the women's movement this is a power struggle often. It is a struggle for political power, financial power, for much more equality. And I sympathise with what you say about when you went out into your working life. That was when you saw, nakedly how men still had the power in the workplace. Obviously, there have been a lot of advances since those days, but I remember working in newspapers in the early 90s and just how entrenched male power still was. I do think that's changed. But yes, I think, as I was saying, I think we've got to get real about this. This is partly about men giving up some of their power so that women can become equal. It's not just, I'm afraid, just going to be a completely friendly, we're all going to get things out of this. So a backlash. I think the backlash is always with us. It's not the case that now that women are going out there, they're experiencing more sexual violence. I think there were always huge levels of sex and domestic violence. Maybe it just wasn't spoken about in the same way. So I'm not sure that is, I don't think we should blame feminism, as it were, and the increase in women's power for rising levels of the violence that we hear about.
Thank you. We have a point here.
My question was about, so obviously males can be feminists, but what do you personally think about male feminists believing that they should have an opinion over women's bodies? So for example, the idea of abortion and how no womb, no opinion, and how that might affect post-operation trans males who still have a womb and therefore should have an opinion.
One of our younger, Ellie.
You make a really valid point. It's difficult. I think a lot of this sort of ties into the power struggle, actually. And I do think a lot of this is about a power struggle. I mean, men have had the power forever, and giving that up is really difficult. So I think it's really easy for men to have these opinions on women's bodies and on abortion and these sorts of topics. But ultimately, if it's not about your body, I don't really think that you should have an opinion about it. Obviously, it is different for trans people. It really, I think, in my opinion, it depends who you are and, each individual case. But as a whole, I don't think that men should have an opinion on a woman's body.
Yeah, Marlene.
It kind of, it's not directly answering your question, but it's kind of about the ownership of women's bodies that men seem to think that they have and have historically had, I guess. I mean, just in terms of how we're kind of viewed and what our physical appearance and what that means in terms of value to what we're like as a woman. I mean, you were just, I think it was you, Natasha, you were kind of speaking about, talking to men and trying to, and how our generation can kind of get these ideas forward and be that change and talk and try and level with men. But it's about whether you're palatable or not. I mean, this is quite a pessimistic kind of view of it, but it's about whether men value you. And a lot of it is about your physical appearance. And if you're not deemed pretty enough to have an opinion, you can shut up, and that's what you see on the internet every single day, if you're not palatable enough to go there.
So, yeah, we all recognise this. It rings true to us. But at the same time, I think I want to say the kind of toxic relationship, let's say, between a couple who've broken up in the family courts, or the toxic stuff that you get online, which polarizes debate, doesn't reflect what we can actually do in face-to-face interactions, where I still feel more optimistic that we can actually engage people and find that everyone wants to talk about this. And if you talk about bodies and objectification and sexual assault, men have got something to say on that too, right? They also have eating disorders and, are sometimes victims of assault and don't have a language for disclosing that. These are things where we can find common ground. And yes, there might be kind of power struggles, but it's not always going to be a sort of, cat and dog struggle. And I actually think one of the things that has helped us to see common ground, and I know this is controversial and some people here may disagree with me, is the recognition in much of the feminist movement that gender is quite fluid, that old kind of depiction of, well, here's what the men are doing and here's what the women are doing doesn't really correspond to where we're at today, where we think of gender as something that is, a much less stable category than we used to think.
Well, that's a very important point, and I know the students at Mary Edwards feel very strongly about that, and my daughter, yes.
Hi, I'm just listening, and I have a few questions and a few suggestions, especially to young people. We talk about struggles. I hear struggles, I hear men are doing this and women are this. And I'll speak from experience being an African and a mother. All men are birthed by a woman, all of them. And we raise them, so we have a level of responsibility to raise young, our boys and our girls in a certain way, the way we want them to grow up, equally. So I don't understand where the difference, all of a sudden the boys are different from the girls. Who teaches them the difference? Who's taught them that women are less capable? They are to be objectified. I have 3 girls, and I grew up in a school where I had the opportunity where boys and girls, there is no difference. And I've grown up feeling that there is no difference. And I'm raising 3 girls with the same feeling that there is no difference. So my daughter is over there, and I'm thinking as she's talking, and I'm just embarrassed her.
I'm going to get her to answer you.
She's saying things I've never heard before, because there is a lot of expectation that if she's experiencing a gentleman, opposition to her sexuality, to her gender or anything, she will always educate them on who she is and who we are. It doesn't have to be an argument about you're a man so you're bad, or I'm a girl so I'm a victim. There is nothing like that. If you went out and somebody touched you, you should be able to say to him, actually, do you have a sister? Would you like somebody to touch your sister up like that? If you haven't got a sister, have you got an aunt? And when we put this to the other, my husband is here, he'll probably kick me all the way home. But we do need to educate and talk to men and explain. But before we get there, I worry about young people and what you guys are actually doing to make the future better. Are you...
Right, okay. Now, we were here to hear different generations, and we've certainly done so now. So as we have to come to a close, it's all on you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd like you to answer that and maybe explain patriarchy and that sort of thing in maybe just a couple of minutes.
No. I think that it's a really good point.
Well said.
Yeah.
Otherwise.
But I was actually going to try and raise this point that I think it does come from parents, not by choice, but accidentally. So, for example, my parents are both here. When we're going out and let's say we're wearing something that you maybe don't agree with for reasons, because obviously as parents, you're trying to look out for your children's safety. I know it's different because you have 3 daughters, but if someone has a daughter and a son, they're more likely to tell the daughter, no, put some more clothes on, rather than tell the son, no, don't be touching girls or don't be doing this. Because that is, for some reason, more of an uncomfortable conversation than telling girls to cover up. And I think it also ties into, I don't think all of the blame is on the men. I think women are also at fault as well, because women can call other women and say, you're not a feminist because you're dressed like this, or why are you dressed like this, and stuff like that. And I just don't think that that helps them, because ultimately, if you want to dress a certain way, the idea of feminism should be that everyone should be allowed to do as they please, obviously morally correct, but do as they please and dress as they want and act as they want without having other people telling them what's right or wrong. So I think that, yeah, women as well need to look at themselves and think, why am I judging other women, or why am I thinking that other women shouldn't be acting a certain way? But yeah, generations need to also look at themselves and think about the way that they're engaging with their children, and not just make it a focus for women that women need to change or girls need to act a certain way, but also having the difficult conversations with men and saying, well, you need to not do this, without it being like I'm blaming my child thing, but it's just a normal conversation that you need to have because the world is the way it is.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end, because you're calling for solidarity between the generations of women. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to thank our brilliant panel. I've learned so much from you, each of you with a very different but very sympathetic to each other point of view. I just finally like to say, we are a women's college, so we think there's still a role for a place where women can be by themselves and talk to each other, while at the same time they go out into the university and meet men. We welcome men day and night, I think it's fair to say, and we have male fellows. From the point of view of the college, our priorities are twofold at the moment. The first is talking to your very powerfully made point about intersectionality, that we began as an institution which gave an opportunity to a group in society who couldn't otherwise get a brilliant education at Cambridge. And now we have to extend that to make sure that people from underrepresented minority groups also have that opportunity. But secondly, that we all here, I know, will be appalled by the extent to which girls and young women have a very low opinion of themselves very often now, and have, we have an epidemic of self-harm and really high levels of mental health problems, twice as high among young women as amongst men. We haven't talked about that here because I think it's a whole subject of its own. But as well as the fact that within the college we're going to set up a new well-being program under a new head of well-being, I want to make the college a place which debates all issues about women, but in particular takes a lead in discussing and debating those issues and looking at solutions to those issues, because I feel all that we hear in the media is about how awful it is, and I think as women we want to start hearing, well, what are we going to do about it? But in the meantime, I would ask you to put your hands together and thank our absolutely wonderful panel. And now please join us for some refreshments. Thank you very much.